Oh, that's the good stuff. So right now there is a trend going around social media, mainly Twitter, called hashtag fixdehya. I didn't know this was happening until just now because I don't have or use Twitter since it's a degenerate platform. Really can't be bothered, to be honest. When I looked at what people were posting, I found some ideas to be interesting and good and others to be complete garbage. For example, the idea that she deals more damage as she takes damage is a trash idea, and I'll get into why later. I have already talked about every single problem with Dehya in a separate video, so this video is going to be more focused on solutions to her problem. I'll start with covering the fundamental and easy to fix problems that are the most realistic to be changed and would make Dehya feel much better to play. First, she should have super armor when she casts her E skill similar to Zhongli. Her sucker passive should remove all this bullcrap and instead have her interruption resistance just last as long as the character is within the field. She should be able to jump in her burst without cancelling it. While in her burst, she should be applied by Pyro, similar to Bennett's burst. This would cleanse her and make her immune to being frozen and immune to being overload since she has increased interruption while in her field. This is important because she has a 70 burst energy cost and it lasts for 4 seconds. So if it gets interrupted, it's a really big deal. The fact that her C6 doesn't get all the damage bonuses of her signature weapon also needs to change, because the duration of the bonuses are too short. The auto-targeting and auto-movement of her burst should be completely removed. The flame fists would only trigger when hitting left click. This allows for easier repositioning and would make her burst feel much better. It would basically function and feel a lot more like Raiden's burst, but instead of slashing enemies, you are pounding them. The size of her E skill's explosion should also be increased so that it can actually burgeon certain enemies properly. Now that the basics and fundamentals are covered, I want to talk about her constellations, as I feel like some of her constellations should be integrated into her base kit. Her C1 and her C2 should be added to her base kit. Her C4 should not be added to her base kit. Instead, I think it would just be better to have her burst deal enough damage to justify the 70 energy burst cost. Similar to how Xiangling or Eula's burst cost a lot of energy, but in turn do a lot of damage. Her C6 should be a lot more powerful. I would double the crit rate and the crit damage increase, but remove the duration increase as it has anti-synergy with Mona and her signature weapon. Because I propose that her C1 and C2 be in her base kit, I will offer an alternative to what her C1 and C2 should be. Her C1 should increase damage mitigation by 1% and her damage reduction by 1% for 5 seconds when she takes damage, stacking up to 10 times. Her new C2 would increase the radius of her E ability and decrease the interval of her pyro application from 2.5 seconds down to 1.5 seconds. I don't think Dehya was designed to be a Burgeoner character, which is why I would add this to her base kit. Adding it as a constellation instead enables her to be a better Burgeoner and maybe something like a 5-star Toma. The next fixes I want to propose are a lot more opinionated and interesting, but also more controversial. There are 2 ways to fix Dehya, as she has no real identity since everything that she does is equally complete garbage across the board. The first way is to amplify her current identities while making sacrifices for the other parts of her kit. For example, Yanfei at C4 can be played as either a tank with a strong shield or as a DPS. Bennett follows the same logic. You can play him as a pure burst support or as a main DPS. However, you can't play both of these playstyles simultaneously. You either build them with attack, EM, and crit for damage, or you build them as a pure support with HP and energy recharge. So essentially, I'm saying to allow for Dehya to build and specialize in either being a good tank or as a good DPS. The other way, and potentially more ludicrous option, would be to add cohesion to her overall kit. This would be something like what Kuki offers, as her kit allows her to be both a healer and a hyper bloomer. I will be covering both an Amplification Specialization kit for Dehya and a cohesive version of Dehya's kit. I'll start with the Specialization version. The first should be that her damage mitigation should be 75% at talent level 10. Also, keep in mind that with the new C1 I suggested, this would cap out at 85%. Her passive that lets her take 60% less damage should always trigger when she takes damage from red blood main effect. The next change would be to alter how her healing passive works. It would instead be that when she is below 70% of her HP, she regenerates 4% of her max HP every second. Additionally, when she is hit by an enemy, she will be healed 30% of her current HP with a 15-second cooldown. The healing of this ability has to be increased, since taking 75% of redirected damage is a lot and she needs to not die from her own ability. The reasoning as to why I think the passive should work like this is that so she must build a lot of HP in order to heal and take more damage. I'm not 100% sure I did the numbers correctly, and this might be either too strong or too weak. But the main idea is that the more raw health you have, the bigger your total effective HP is with Dehya. It means that you would have to sacrifice damage for more raw HP healing and tankiness, to the point where you want to get HP on your Goblet, Sands, and Circlet instead of damage bonus or crit. This, in combination with her interruption resistance, should make her a very good tank and remove the necessity for a shielder or healer and hopefully fix her tankiness issues. So what about her damage issues? The first change should be to increase her multipliers because they are simply too low. Hoyo could also make her burst count as normal attacks so that she can run a Vape Hydro team comp. However, they might have done this for good reason. For example, it has brought Mona back in a new and useful way. They might be trying to create more diversity among character usage since every single Pyro DPS uses either Xingqiu or Yelan, or both at the same time. If this is the case, then the other option would be to just significantly increase the multipliers on her burst so that they do a lot more damage to the point where you can justify using her burst for the entire 4 seconds. Effectively making her a quick swap utility type DPS that can provide off-field pyro application, interruption to resistance, and quick burst damage. It is also important to note that if you do build her as a DPS, you won't benefit from her HP passives as much and you would need to run her with a healer. This is fine because when you're using her in this way, she is meant to be a damage dealer, not a supportive unit. It's why I mentioned before that some of her HP regeneration and healing should be based on her current HP and not maximum HP in this iteration. With this version of Dehya, you would be able to play her as a quick swap DPS that has some utility, but also needs a healer. Or, alternatively, you could fully invest into her being a full-on tank for your team that absorbs most of the damage taken, but does trash damage. Basically, it would make her a shielder without actually having a shield that also applies pyro periodically. Some people might find the idea of her working a lot like a shielder to be boring, but I think her kit would still be interesting, and in a way she would have an unbreakable shield. This would also mean that Thoma as a Burgeoner would not be power crept and still a viable option. The second version of Dehya would be a cohesive version that I think is a lot more interesting. As I previously mentioned, there has been the idea floating around that Dehya should work like a Berzerker, where the more damage she takes, the more damage she deals. I think this is a cool idea, but people's version of it is garbage, so I'm going to try and work with it. Some people fail to realize how difficult this is to actually make work. Most assume you can simply make her damage taken converted into actual damage dealt. But the thing is that this is an unreliable and inconsistent way of dealing damage. It works in PvP games with things like Thorn's effect because you can always count on players to deal damage to you, since that's the whole point of a PvP game. However, Genshin isn't a PvP game, it's a PvE game, meaning the amount of damage you take and when you take that damage is based on the monsters you fight. Different monsters deal varying amounts of damage and can be a lot more unpredictable. Beta mains know what I'm talking about. You ever just sit there waiting for an enemy to hit you? It's annoying and unreliable. The best way to effectively and consistently take damage is by doing the damage to yourself, not relying on monsters to do so. We as players can accomplish this by either using a character's ability, like Zhao's Burst or Hu Tao's skill, or by using elemental reactions like Burgeon. This means that Dehya's abilities would probably need some sort of additional mechanic to ensure that you can take a reliable amount of damage. Something like increasing the damage interval rate of her Red Blood main effect, or she takes increased damage by reducing her defense, or having the ability to deal damage to herself similar to Zhao's Burst with an ability. There are two ways to make the damage calculation work, either by having Dehya have a built-in reflection mechanic similar to the Ocean-Hued Clam set, or a damage conversion where she deals more damage the more damage she takes, similar to the Vermilion Hereafter effect. I'm going to try and implement both ideas into this new revised kit. The first way would be with her E skill, where all the damage taken within her pyro field is stored in a meter built up. Afterwards, when the field expires, all the damage that was taken within the field would explode and deal pyro damage in the field's AoE. Think of it as something similar to Eula's Burst, but instead of dealing damage to explode the sword, you must take damage. And if you were to time this right, it would mean that you could vape Dehya's E ability for big damage. Then, for her burst, have the amount of max HP lost be translated into increased damage. Just as an example of what I mean, it would be something like for every 1% of max HP lost, Dehya deals 5% increased burst damage. Conversely, this could also be an elemental mastery buff instead, making her an interesting Burgeon character that focuses on taking damage from Burgeons rather than mitigating it. But that's all I was really able to come up with, and further ideas I had just ended up being too unrealistic. Then again, Hoyoverse implementing any sort of feedback or ideas from players is unrealistic. I couldn't figure out a way to integrate her tankiness identity in a cohesive way without sacrificing her damage. This is because the tankier I made her, the less damage she took, and therefore the less damage she dealt. I am no character game designer, but I think this cohesive version is unrealistic and kind of a failure in comparison to my other idea. I still thought it was cool enough to share though. What do you guys think of my ideas? Good, bad, overpowered, underpowered? I tried to make her in line with the other standard banner characters like Mona and Tainari. Also let me know what changes you would want to see to Dehya. I'm interested in hearing your ideas, and be sure to leave any sort of constructive criticism. I thought I too should join in on this sort of movement, not just because I want justice for Dehya mains. Even people who don't like Dehya or don't want to pull for her should push for feedback, because if something doesn't change, it creates a precedent for Hoyoverse to get away with it again in the future. I don't want someone else to be like me, waiting 6 months for a character only to be utterly disappointed. Anyways, I gotta get back to huffing my copium. Remember to take care and have an amazing day.